She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. For 7 hours, she lay trapped beneath tons of concrete and steel, knowing that one sound, one breath too loud, might bring the entire structure down on her head. March 3, 1945, somewhere in the ruins of Dresden, Germany, a city that had been reduced to ash and rubble just weeks before, a woman named Greta Hoffman disappeared beneath the earth. And when she finally emerged, she would never speak about what happened in those 7 hours. Not to her family, not to the authorities, not until 40 years later when a researcher found her living in a small apartment in Munich, and she finally told the story of how silence became survival. Greta Hoffman was not a soldier. She was not a spy or a resistance fighter. She was a nurse, a daughter, and like millions of other German women caught in the machinery of World War II, she was simply trying to survive in a world that had gone insane. Born in 1919 in Leipzig, she grew up in the anxious years between the wars, the daughter of a bookbinder and a seamstress. Her childhood was marked by economic depression, political chaos, and the slow, creeping darkness of the Nazi regime taking hold. By 1938, she had completed her training as a Krankenschwester, a registered nurse at the Leipzig Municipal Hospital. She was 19 years old, intelligent, efficient, and like many young Germans of her generation, politically numb. The regime was everywhere. You couldn't fight it, you couldn't question it. You just kept your head down and did your work. She specialized in trauma care, treating factory accidents, car crashes, the everyday emergencies of urban life. But by 1939, when the war began, the nature of trauma changed. Suddenly it was soldiers, wounded soldiers, then civilians caught in bombing raids, then refugees, then children. In January 1945, Greta received orders to report to Dresden. The city, known for its Baroque architecture and cultural heritage, had become a processing center for refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army from the east. Tens of thousands of people were flooding into the city, sick, wounded, traumatized, desperate. The hospitals were overwhelmed. Nurses like Greta were being pulled from all over Germany to help manage the humanitarian crisis. She arrived on January 28, 1945, and found a city transformed. Dresden's population had swollen from 600,000 to nearly 1 million people. Every school, church, warehouse, and basement had been converted into makeshift shelters. The medical infrastructure was collapsing under the weight. And then, on the night of February 13, 1945, the city died. The Allied bombing of Dresden was one of the most controversial operations of World War II. Over 2 days, British and American bombers dropped nearly 4,000 tons of high-explosive and incendiary bombs, creating a firestorm that reached temperatures of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The exact death toll remains disputed. Conservative estimates put it at 25,000. Some sources claim as many as 135,000. What's certain is that the city center was obliterated, turned into a landscape of rubble, ash, and carbonized bodies. Greta survived the initial bombing. She had been working in a converted bunker beneath the Johannstadt Hospital on the city's eastern edge when the first wave hit. The bunker held. The hospital above it did not. When she emerged on February 15, 1945, she found herself in a different world. The hospital was gone. The streets were unrecognizable. Everything smelled like smoke and death. Bodies were everywhere, some intact, most not. And the survivors, those who remained, moved through the ruins like ghosts, searching for loved ones, for food, for any reason to keep living. For the next 2 weeks, Greta worked in the ruins. There was no hospital anymore, just triage stations set up in basements and bomb shelters. She treated burns, crush injuries, amputations performed with whatever tools were available. She watched people die from infections because there was no penicillin, watched children die from dehydration because the water mains were destroyed. The city was a mass grave that some people still walked around in. By early March, Soviet forces were less than 100 miles from Dresden. The city was being evacuated, or at least those who could move were leaving. But Greta stayed. There were still wounded, still people who needed help. On March 2, 1945, She received word that a group of wounded soldiers and civilians were sheltering in a partially collapsed bunker complex in the Altstadt district, the old city center. The area was extremely unstable. Buildings that looked intact would suddenly collapse. Underground passages were flooding. But people were trapped there, and someone had to go in. Greta volunteered. She packed a medical bag with what little supplies remained: morphine, bandages, sulfur powder, and on the morning of March 3, 1945, she descended into the ruins alone. She would not emerge until that night, and what happened in those 7 hours would define the rest of her life.
The bunker complex beneath Dresden's Altstadt had been built in the 1930s as part of the city's civil defense system. It was a network of reinforced concrete chambers and tunnels designed to shelter up to 500 people during air raids. After the firebombing, parts of the complex had collapsed, but sections remained accessible. It had become a refuge for those too injured or too afraid to move through the ruins above. Greta entered through what had been a street-level entrance, now partially buried under rubble. She carried a flashlight, her medical bag, and a small canteen of water. The entrance stairs were intact for the first dozen steps, then became a treacherous slope of broken concrete and twisted metal. She could hear voices below, echoing in the darkness, calls for help, moaning, the sound of water dripping. The main chamber was perhaps 30 feet underground, a large concrete room that had once held wooden benches but was now a chaos of debris and desperate humanity. Greta counted 14 people. Most were elderly or injured. 3 were children. 2 were soldiers with wounds that had been poorly dressed days ago and were now obviously infected. The air was thick with the smell of human waste, infection, and fear. She set to work immediately, treating the worst injuries first: an old man with a compound fracture of the leg, a woman with severe burns on her arms and face, a child with pneumonia, rattling breaths in the darkness. She had morphine for 6 people. She had 14 patients. She made choices. Terrible, necessary choices. Who got the morphine? Who got clean bandages? Who got the last of her sulfur powder? The kind of choices that would haunt her for decades. She had been working for perhaps 90 minutes when she heard it. A deep, grinding sound from above, the kind of sound that meant structural failure. Everyone in the bunker froze, looking up at the concrete ceiling. Dust fell in streams from cracks that had suddenly appeared. Greta later said that in that moment, she knew. She knew what was about to happen. And there was no time to run, no time to do anything but drop flat and hope. The ceiling came down. The collapse lasted maybe 5 seconds, but those 5 seconds redefined reality. Greta was knocked flat by the pressure wave, her flashlight flying from her hand, plunging the space into absolute darkness. The sound was beyond description, a physical force that felt like it was tearing her apart from the inside. Concrete, steel, timber, all coming down at once. She felt impacts all around her, felt something heavy slam across her legs, felt the air itself become solid with dust and debris. And then silence. Not peaceful silence, the terrible silence of a mass grave. She couldn't see, couldn't move her legs, could barely breathe. The air was so thick with concrete dust that every breath was like inhaling sand. She coughed, choked, forced herself to breathe slowly through her nose, filtering the air through the nostrils and the fabric of her nurse's uniform, which she'd pulled up over her face. As her ears adjusted to the new silence, she began to hear other sounds. Groaning metals settling, water dripping closer and faster than before. A pipe had ruptured. And worst of all, she heard breathing. Not her own, someone else. Close by, very close. Shallow, ragged breathing that spoke of serious injury. She tried to move and immediately regretted it. Her legs were pinned beneath something heavy, concrete or steel, she couldn't tell in the darkness. Her left arm was free, her right arm trapped at her side. She could move her head slightly, maybe 3 inches in any direction, before it pressed against debris. She was in a void, a pocket space beneath the collapse, maybe 2 feet high at most. A tomb with just enough air to keep her conscious, just enough space to be aware of her own entrapment. The breathing she'd heard was directly in front of her face, maybe 6 inches away. She could feel the movement of air. "Who's there?" she whispered in German. No response, just that labored breathing, in and out, in and out. She realized with horror that whoever it was might be unconscious, or dying, or already dead but still drawing automatic breaths. She'd seen it before in the hospital, bodies that kept breathing for minutes after brain death. She tried again. "Can you hear me?" Still no response, just breathing. And then another sound joined it, a low, rhythmic creaking from above, the sound of weight shifting on unstable debris, the sound that meant the collapse wasn't finished, that more could come down at any moment. And Greta Hoffman, trapped in absolute darkness with tons of debris pressing down from all sides, understood her survival depended on one thing: absolute silence, because any vibration, any movement, any sound loud enough to disturb the precarious balance of rubble above her might trigger a secondary collapse that would crush her instantly. So she stopped moving. She stopped talking. She even tried to control her breathing, making it as shallow and silent as possible. And she began the longest 7 hours of her life.
What happens to a human mind forced into absolute stillness? Greta later described it as a descent into a strange twilight state, not quite awake, not quite asleep, but hyper-aware of every sensation, every sound, every thought. Time stopped having meaning. Minutes felt like hours. Hours collapsed into moments. She lost track of whether she'd been there for minutes or days. The first hour was dominated by physical sensation. The pain in her trapped legs was intense, a constant pressure that made her want to scream, to thrash, to do anything to relieve it. But she couldn't. So she employed a technique she'd learned in nursing school for dealing with patients in severe pain who couldn't receive morphine: mental compartmentalization. She imagined the pain as a separate thing, a red light in her mind that she could observe without being consumed by. It didn't make the pain disappear, but it made it bearable. Barely. Thirst came next. Her mouth was full of concrete dust, her throat raw from the initial cloud of debris. She desperately wanted water, but her canteen was somewhere in the rubble, crushed or lost. She tried to generate saliva by thinking about lemons, about cool water from the well at her grandmother's house in Leipzig. It helped minimally. Her tongue swelled, her lips cracked, but she didn't cry. Tears would have wasted precious moisture. By the second hour, her mind began to wander. She thought about her family, her mother in Leipzig, her younger brother Klaus, who was somewhere on the Eastern Front, if he was even still alive, her father, who had died in 1942 from a heart attack, one of the lucky ones who didn't have to see what Germany had become. She wondered if they would ever know what happened to her, if anyone would find her body, if she would just disappear, one more missing person among millions. The breathing in front of her continued, unchanging. She had determined it must be male, based on the depth and rhythm. One of the soldiers, perhaps, or the old man with the leg fracture. Whoever it was, they were unconscious and might never wake up. She was sharing her tomb with someone who was probably dying. The thought should have horrified her. Instead, she found it almost comforting. At least she wasn't alone. At least she would die with another human being present, even if neither of them could speak. By the third hour, she began to hallucinate. Not wild visions, but subtle distortions of reality. She thought she heard her mother calling her name, thought she saw light filtering through the debris, though she knew there was no light, not down here. Her mind was beginning to protect her from the horror of her situation by creating small escapes, brief moments where she was somewhere else, someone else. She fought against it. She knew from medical training that hallucinations in trauma situations often preceded death, the mind escaping before the body quit. So she forced herself to stay present, to focus on concrete details. She mentally recited the bones of the human body, starting with the skull and working down: frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, sphenoid, ethmoid. The familiar litany anchored her, reminded her that she was Greta Hoffman. She was a nurse. She knew things. She had value. She had reasons to survive. Around the fourth hour, the breathing in front of her changed. It became shallower, faster, then slower, then stopped. Just stopped. Mid-breath, the inhalation that never became an exhalation. She waited in the darkness, listening, hoping it would resume. It didn't. The person was dead. She was alone now, truly alone, trapped in a concrete tomb with a corpse 6 inches from her face. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. While the breathing had continued, she had something to focus on, a rhythm that wasn't her own, proof that life existed beyond her own consciousness. Now there was just silence, her own breathing, her own heartbeat, nothing else. She was alone with herself in a way that most people never experience, completely isolated. And the questions began to spiral. How long had she been here? Hours? Days? Was anyone even looking for her? Did anyone know she'd come down here? Would they assume she'd died in the bombing like thousands of others? Would they even bother to dig through this unstable rubble? Then she heard something that changed everything. Voices. Faint, distorted by layers of concrete and debris, but unmistakably human. German voices, men shouting, the sound of tools striking rubble. Rescue workers. They were digging. They were looking for survivors. Hope, sudden and sharp as a knife, cut through her despair. She wanted to scream, to call out, to bang on the concrete. They were right there, maybe 20 feet away, maybe less. If she could just make a sound, any sound, they would know she was here. They would dig her out. But she couldn't, because the creaking above her gotten worse. The structure was incredibly unstable. Any loud noise, any vibration might trigger another collapse. If she called out and brought more debris down, she might kill not only herself but also the rescuers above. She had taken an oath as a nurse: first, do no harm. So she stayed silent. She listened to the voices, listened to them getting closer, then farther away, then fading entirely. They were giving up. They thought there were no survivors, and Greta Hoffman, very much alive, very much aware, let them leave. Let them abandon her, because making noise might have killed them. That moment, she would later say, was harder than anything else. Harder than the pain, the thirst, the darkness. Choosing silence when rescue was so close. Choosing possible death over certain disaster. It broke something in her. She began to cry silently, tears cutting tracks through the concrete dust on her face. But even her crying was controlled, quiet, because she had learned the most terrible lesson of survival. Sometimes living means accepting that you might die. Sometimes the brave thing isn't fighting, it's waiting, it's enduring, it's suffering in silence because the alternative is worse.
By the 5th hour, Greta's physical condition had deteriorated significantly. She was severely dehydrated. Her legs, pinned beneath the debris, had gone numb, which she knew was a very bad sign. Nerve damage at minimum. Possible crush syndrome, where trapped limbs release toxins into the bloodstream once freed, causing kidney failure and death. She'd seen it in bombing victims before.
But there was nothing she could do. She couldn't free herself. She could only wait. The darkness had become total. Not the darkness of a moonless night, where your eyes eventually adjust and you can see shapes and shadows. This was absolute absence of light. The kind of darkness that makes you question whether your eyes are even open. She found herself blinking repeatedly just to feel the sensation of her eyelids moving, proof that she still had control over some part of her body. Time had become meaningless. She had no watch, no way to track the passage of minutes or hours. She tried to count her breaths, making each one a single unit of time, but she kept losing count, kept drifting away into that strange twilight state where consciousness and unconsciousness blurred together. She dreamed while awake, dreamed about her nursing training in Leipzig, dreamed about the children's ward where she'd worked before the war, dreamed about a life that seemed to belong to someone else, someone who had died in the firebombing, leaving only this trapped, silent shadow behind. The corpse in front of her had begun to smell. Not strongly yet. The cold March air preserved things, but enough that she could detect it. The sweet, sick odor of early decomposition. In normal circumstances, it would have made her gag. Here, trapped in this tiny void with nowhere to move, it was just another sensation to compartmentalize. Another detail of her nightmare to file away in the growing catalog of horrors she was experiencing. By the 6th hour, she had accepted that she was going to die. Not dramatically, not with fear or panic, but with a strange calm. She thought about what death would be like. Would it hurt? Would she simply drift away into unconsciousness? Would there be anything after, or just nothing? She'd been raised Lutheran, taught about heaven and hell, but she'd seen too much death in her nursing career to have any certainty about what came next. She hoped there was something, some continuation, some meaning. But if there wasn't, if death was just the end, then at least the suffering would stop. At least she wouldn't have to be afraid anymore. She began to say goodbye in her mind. Goodbye to her mother, who would never know what happened to her daughter. Goodbye to Klaus, if he was still alive. Goodbye to the life she'd planned before the war, the simple dreams of marriage and children and a quiet life. Goodbye to the future that would never happen. And strangely, she found peace in it, acceptance. If this was how she died, trapped in silence beneath the ruins of a destroyed city, at least she had tried. At least she had been helping people when the end came. There were worse ways to die. She'd seen them. What saved Greta Hoffman wasn't courage or strength or determination. It was a dog. Around the 7th hour, as she drifted in and out of consciousness, barely aware anymore of where she was or why she couldn't move, she heard a new sound. Scratching. Close by. Rhythmic, persistent scratching. Then barking. A dog was digging in the rubble above her. Search and rescue dogs had been brought into Dresden to help locate survivors in the ruins. German shepherds mostly, trained to detect human scent beneath debris. One of them, a dog named Blitz, had picked up a scent in the collapsed bunker complex and refused to leave. His handler, a civil defense worker named Werner Koch, tried to call him away. The area was too unstable. But Blitz wouldn't budge. He kept digging, kept barking, kept insisting that something was down there. Koch finally decided to investigate. He and 2 other workers began carefully removing debris from the area where Blitz was digging. It was slow, dangerous work. The entire structure could collapse at any moment, but the dog was so insistent, and they learned to trust the dogs. More often than not, they were right. They dug for nearly 2 hours. Greta heard none of it. She was unconscious by then, her body shutting down from dehydration and shock. She didn't hear them break through into the void where she was trapped, didn't hear Werner Koch's exclamation when his flashlight beam found her face, didn't feel them carefully, painstakingly removing the debris that pinned her legs. She woke up in a field hospital, in a bed with clean sheets, with water being spooned into her mouth and a doctor examining her legs. She'd been unconscious for 14 hours. The doctor told her she was incredibly lucky. Her legs were badly bruised, and she had nerve damage that would take months to heal, but there were no broken bones, no crush syndrome. Against all odds, she would walk again. They asked her what happened, and she tried to explain, tried to tell them about the 7 hours in the darkness, about the breathing that stopped, about hearing the rescuers and staying silent. But the words wouldn't come. Every time she tried to speak about it, her throat closed up. She would start shaking, hyperventilating. So the doctors told her not to talk about it, told her it was trauma, told her time would heal it. They were wrong. Time doesn't heal everything. Some wounds stay open forever.
Greta survived the war. She was evacuated from Dresden in mid-March 1945, moved to a hospital in Bavaria, then eventually made her way back to Leipzig after Germany's surrender. She found her mother alive, but her brother Klaus had been killed near Berlin in the final weeks of the war. She returned to nursing, working at the same municipal hospital where she'd trained. But she was different. Her colleagues noticed it. The way she would freeze if a door slammed, the way she couldn't work in basements, the way she had to have lights on constantly, even when sleeping. She never spoke about Dresden, never mentioned the bunker. When people asked about her experience in the war, she would say simply, "I was a nurse, I helped where I could," and she would change the subject. In 1952, she married a school teacher named Friedrich Bauer. They moved to Munich, had no children, lived quietly. She continued nursing until 1975, when she retired at 56, earlier than necessary. She told her husband she was tired. That was all she ever told him about why. For 40 years, she carried the memory of those 7 hours alone, never spoke of it, never wrote about it, buried it as deeply as she'd been buried beneath the rubble. Until 1985, when a researcher named Dr. Margaret Scholl, conducting oral history interviews with Dresden bombing survivors, tracked her down. Dr. Scholl had found Greta's name in civil defense records from March 1945, one of the few documented survivors pulled from the Altstadt bunker complex. She wrote to Greta, asking for an interview. Greta refused at first, then refused again, but Dr. Scholl persisted, and finally, on a cold November afternoon in 1985, Greta invited her to the small Munich apartment where she lived. The interview lasted 6 hours. Greta wept through most of it, describing details she'd never spoken aloud. The breathing in the darkness, the moment it stopped, the rescue workers she heard but couldn't call to, the acceptance of death, the dog that saved her life. Dr. Scholl recorded it all, asked gentle questions, and at the end asked Greta why she'd never told anyone. Greta's answer was simple. Because no one would understand, because even I don't understand how I did it, and because some things, when you speak them out loud, they become real in a way they weren't before, and I couldn't bear for it to be more real than it already was. Greta Hoffman died in 1994 at the age of 75. Her husband Friedrich found her in their apartment, sitting in her favorite chair, looking out the window. Peaceful. The doctor said it was a heart attack, quick and relatively painless. At her funeral, Dr. Scholl spoke, telling the assembled mourners about Greta's experience in the bunker. Many of them, including some of Greta's closest friends, were hearing the story for the first time. They were stunned. They'd known her for decades and never suspected she'd survived such an ordeal. But that was Greta's way. She was part of a generation that believed suffering was private, that trauma was something you carried inside, that heroism wasn't something you talked about. She'd survived 7 hours trapped beneath collapsed concrete, made choices that would haunt her for the rest of her life, and then come home and lived quietly, never asking for recognition or sympathy. The transcript of Dr. Scholl's 1985 interview with Greta is now archived at the Dresden Military History Museum. It runs to 127 pages. Near the end, Dr. Scholl asks Greta what she wants people to understand about her experience. Greta's response is worth preserving in full. "I want people to understand that survival isn't always heroic. Sometimes it's just endurance. Sometimes it's just the ability to suffer longer than the situation wants to kill you. I didn't do anything brave in that bunker. I just didn't die. I lay there in the dark, and I waited, and I was silent, and I didn't die. That's all. The dog did the brave thing. The rescuers did the brave thing. I just didn't die." But there's a truth in that humility that reveals the deeper heroism. Greta Hoffman, trapped in absolute darkness with crushing pain and mortal fear, made a conscious choice to remain silent even when rescue was near. She chose the possibility of her own death over the certainty of causing harm to others. She endured 7 hours of psychological and physical torture with no guarantee of survival. And then she lived with the memory of it for 50 years, never seeking attention or sympathy. That's not just survival. That's strength of a kind most of us will never have to discover in ourselves. The strength to suffer silently, to make impossible choices, to carry unbearable weight, to live with trauma and never use it as an excuse, to simply continue, day after day, being useful, being kind, being human.
Greta Hoffman's story is important not because it's unique, but because it isn't. Across World War II, across every war, there are thousands of stories like hers. People who survived impossible situations through sheer endurance, who made terrible choices with only bad options, who carried trauma silently for decades. They're not famous. There are no monuments to them. But their quiet strength is perhaps more remarkable than any battlefield heroics. What would you do in absolute darkness, pinned beneath tons of rubble, knowing that making a sound might kill you? Most of us will never face that choice, and we should be grateful. But we can honor those who did by remembering their stories, by understanding that heroism isn't always dramatic, that survival sometimes looks like nothing more than continuing to breathe when everything in you wants to scream. Greta Hoffman was buried in Munich's Waldfriedhof Cemetery. Her headstone is simple. Greta Bauer, née Hoffman, 1919 to 1994. Nurse, wife, survivor. That last word was added at her husband's insistence. He wanted people to know, to remember, to understand that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, not because they're special, but because circumstances demand it, and they simply refuse to quit. So here's the real question. What are you carrying silently? What weight do you bear that no one sees? What have you survived that you've never spoken about? Because, in a way, we all have our bunkers, our collapsed spaces where we're trapped in darkness, our moments where survival means silence. And maybe the lesson isn't about the dramatic rescue or the heroic escape. Maybe it's about the quiet strength it takes to endure, to wait, to hope, to simply refuse to give up, even when giving up would be so much easier. Leave your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, share it, because sometimes the most important stories are the ones about ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances and simply kept breathing. That's what Greta Hoffman did, for 7 hours in the darkness, and then for 50 more years in the light. She survived, She endured. She continued. And in the end, maybe that's the most heroic thing any of us can do.